Welcome to Fantasy Hockey Preview. Today I will be talking about players to avoid. A center to avoid is Paul Stastny. Paul Stastny signed a 4-year deal worth $7 million per season with the St. Louis Blues. But the problem is, Paul Stastny really isn't that big a point producer. Paul Stastny is mostly a setup man, but he's not a first-line center. He's going to be on the second line and second power play for the Blues, which doesn't do very well for his fantasy value. He's not playing with Tarasenko. So if you're not playing with Tarasenko, that really doesn't do well for your fantasy value. He is going to be playing with Robby Fabbri, likely, and Troy Brouwer. I'm not sure how good Troy Brouwer and Robby Fabbri will be doing. So unless you're playing with Tarasenko on the Blues, your fantasy value isn't going to be too good. Another center to avoid is Eric Staal. Eric Staal's production is going to decline year by year. He's more of a borderline second or third line center at this point of his career. Even though he's probably going to get a good free agent contract because of how slim the market is for centers, Eric Staal is no longer a viable option as a center in fantasy hockey. So I would definitely avoid Eric Staal in fantasy hockey. Another player to avoid is left winger Brad Marchand. Brad Marchand had set career highs in goals and points this season. I do not expect Brad Marchand to repeat the season he had last year, as the Bruins are not going to do very good next year. I don't think they will do very good. If any indicator last season, at the end of last season, was that the Bruins are just not that good anymore. Another left winger to avoid is Zach Parise. Zach Parise does produce, but the problem with Zach Parise is injuries. He has been injured quite a bit the past few years. So in fantasy hockey, you want players that will definitely be healthy. It's not the point of being able to produce, it's the point of being healthy. You want players that both produce and be healthy. If he's never healthy, he can't produce. Another player is Marian Hossa, right winger. Marian Hossa, similar to Zach Parise, is seemingly hurt all the time. Not that he's not producing when he's healthy, but similar to Parise, he seems to be injured quite a bit. Perhaps age has a little factor to do with that, but I would try to avoid Marian Hossa in the fantasy drafts. Another player to avoid is Rick Nash. Rick Nash just is not the same player he was in Columbus. Let's just face it. Rick Nash is no longer one of the premier goal scorers in the league. He is, at best, a 30 goal scorer. Maybe a 25 goal scorer, but I don't think he's going to be a 40 goal scorer anytime soon. As long as he stays on the Rangers, he's not going to be a 40 goal scorer. If he gets traded, who knows? But if he stays on the Rangers, he's not going to be the go-to guy. So if he stays on the Rangers, I would avoid him. Another one to avoid is Ryan McDonagh. It's not that Ryan McDonagh isn't a good defenseman. He's a great defenseman in real life. But there is a difference between real life and fantasy. He doesn't really put up that many points, so therefore he's not that productive in fantasy. So he's going to be ranked pretty high. So where you would be taking him would be way too high for his actual production value. Another defenseman to avoid is Mike Green. Mike Green, definitely avoid him. Detroit is not going anywhere next year. Detroit is probably going to miss the playoffs. They're getting older. Their franchise is in a state of panic right now. I mean, they have some decent players, don't get me wrong, but their defense is a mess. And Mike Green is not helping the solution to it. Another defenseman to avoid is Dennis Wideman. Dennis Wideman seems to be an odd man out in Calgary. Unless he gets traded, I would try to avoid him. Because you have Giordano, Brody, Hamilton. You really don't need Wideman there. And last defenseman to avoid is Johnny Boychuk. Johnny Boychuk is a solid defenseman, but it's only if you have hit and block shots. If your league does not have hits and block shots, then Johnny Boychuk doesn't have that great of fantasy value because he's no longer on the first power play unit, and he's no longer on the first defensive pair. A utility player to avoid is Yuri HUDLER. Yuri HUDLER had a fluky career high season 2 years ago. He wasn't able to repeat that season, and I don't think he will. That was a career high. He's not going to repeat those numbers ever again, probably. A goaltender to avoid is Ryan Miller. Ryan Miller is just a shell of himself. He's not going to be an elite goalie again. Unless, like Luongo, he gets traded back to a team like the Sabres or a team that needs a #1 goalie and he refines his confidence. Because right now, his confidence is next to zero. Another goalie to avoid is HALAK. With Thomas Greiss almost taking the throne in the Long Island or Brooklyn or whatever their name is, still the New York Islanders. The HALAK will be the backup goalie next year, or they will be 1A, 1B. So HALAK is no longer the clear-cut #1 goalie. In fact, Thomas Greiss may get the bulk of the workload. Another player to avoid is Nail Yakupov. Nail Yakupov may go down as one of the bigger busts in the last few drafts. I mean, granted, the 2012 draft wasn't really that good, but in Edmonton's position, they really needed a defenseman after drafting, 2 forwards in a row. They needed a defenseman, and they should have drafted Ryan Murray, but no, they didn't. Another bench player to avoid is Tomas Tatar of the Detroit Red Wings. Tomas Tatar had a promising future after a breakout year last year, but Tomas Tatar had kind of a setback, and he saw his numbers drop, actually. So I would try to avoid some of the Detroit Red Wings players in general. Mike Ribeiro is another player to avoid. Mike Ribeiro is no longer center to Philip Forsberg. Therefore, he is no longer that valuable in fantasy hockey. The reason why Ribeiro was valuable in the first place was because he was going to be the center to Philip Forsberg. If he's not going to center Philip Forsberg, then Ribeiro is almost next to useless. And the final player to avoid is Jimmy Howard. Jimmy Howard may find his way out of Detroit. He might not, but Jimmy Howard is likely going to be the backup to Mrazek, so his fantasy value is not going to be high. So to review this list, players to avoid are Paul Stastny, Eric Staal, Zach Parise, Brad Marchand, Rick Nash, Marian Hossa, Ryan McDonagh, Mike Green, Dennis Wideman, Johnny Boychuk, Yuri HUDLER, Ryan Miller, HALAK, Nail Yakupov, Tomas Tatar, Jimmy Howard, and Mike Ribeiro. Next episode, I'll be talking about sleepers in fantasy hockey.